Got anyone coming shot with a silver bullet? It was an odd question for Detective Hank Carrington to be asked. It was on a busy morning at the police station for a mid-sized city in central Mississippi. Carrington had been, just moments before, harboring thoughts of a good breakfast on the way home after a long and difficult shift, followed by several hours of sleep. But the question stopped him. "A silver bullet? No, that's a new one," Carrington said. The question had been asked by another of the department's detectives, Bianca Guthridge. "I think you should see this," Guthridge said, and indicated the direction in which the interview rooms could be found. Carrington detoured without hesitation. As they walked into the viewing bay, Carrington asked, "What do we got?" In the room, beyond the viewing bay's glass, a teenage boy sat in handcuffs. The cuffs were pinned to the heavy table in front of him with an immobilization bolt, and the table was bolted to the floor. Carrington saw that two other detectives, Pellman and Pavitz, were in the room seated across from the teenager and were in the middle of questioning him. The kid was gigantic. Carrington estimated that if this teenager were to stand up from the table he was handcuffed to, he would be at least 6.5 feet tall. The kid's arms were freakishly long and heavily muscled. His shoulders were wider, and the muscles on his chest and back were bigger than what Carrington had seen on bodybuilders on TV. Those hands locked in the cuffs were huge. The kid looked like he could pull a stump out of the ground with them if he wanted. Pellman and Pavitz were not small men, but they were almost childlike in contrast to their hulking prisoner. "This kid just got arrested over at the hospital," Guthridge said to Carrington. "He carried a young lady into the emergency room. She's alive, but in bad shape." "Was she shot?" Carrington asked. "No, she's not the gunshot victim," Guthridge said. "She has multiple cuts and a bunch of other wounds on her, though." "Wait, what do you mean the kid carried her into the emergency room?" Carrington asked. "Like, literally carried?" "Yup," replied Guthridge. "We're not exactly sure how he got to the hospital with her. No car. Supposedly, he walked for miles carrying her. She was banged up real bad, lots of blood loss. Detectives Pellman and Pavitz were already there on another case, and they searched the kid on suspicion. They found a handgun on the kid. It had one unfired cartridge and one empty shell. Gunfire residue indicates the shell was fired recently." "Okay," said Carrington. "What else do we know?" "Get this," Guthridge said. "Tests indicate the bullet that's still in its cartridge is made out of solid silver." "Come on, seriously?" said Carrington. "Don't those things not even work? Doesn't a bullet made out of silver have the wrong density or melting point or something like that?" "Yeah," Guthridge replied, "but it'll kill someone just as dead as a regular bullet if you get up real close. It's not unreasonable to suspect the bullet that got fired was a silver bullet as well. I haven't come across anything like that in the current case files. Have you, Detective?" "No, not yet," Carrington said. Then he thumbed at the glass in the direction of the teenage prisoner. "So, what's his story?" "That kid hasn't uttered a word since they brought him in," Guthridge said. "Nothing. Not even lawyer." "Kid have an ID?" Carrington asked. "Nope," said Guthridge. "Nothing in his pockets except a toothbrush and a library card." "Rap sheet?" Carrington asked. "We're still working on getting any records on him at all," Guthridge replied. "Not much to go on other than that library card that was in his pocket." "Oh, what are the charges?" Carrington asked. So far, I haven't heard anything to indicate the kid committed a crime. Discharge of a firearm within municipal town limits, for starters, Guthridge replied. Should have more after we interview the girl. What have they grilled him on so far? Carrington asked. The gun and the girl, Guthridge said. Nothing yet on why that gun got fired. He's been quiet up to this point. No answers yet. Smart, Carrington said. His daddy must be a lawyer. Yeah, well, we gotta find out who he shot, Guthridge said. Detective Pellman, in the interview room, was asking the young prisoner, Can we talk about this gun? We're just asking for your help with this. That's all we're doing here. Where'd the gun come from? The kid said nothing. Son, we really need your help here, Detective Pavitz said to the kid. You can help everybody out here if you just answer a couple of questions. Tell us, straight up, was this gun fired recently? The kid said nothing. They already got confirmation of powder residue on this kid's hands? Carrington asked Guthridge back in the viewing booth. Guthridge looked down at her notepad. Yup, said Guthridge. Pavitz is just setting this kid up to pull the rug out from under him. They haven't rattled his tongue loose yet, and they're working on it. You seriously can't help us out here? Pellman was saying to the kid. Are you really not going to help us out here? This is pretty serious. Are you just going to sit there and not say anything? Are you aware about how serious this is? Look, young man, said Pavitz, let's just start out with where you got this gun. Did someone give you this gun? Like a relative? Did you buy it? Are you carrying it around for protection? I mean, you're just exercising your Second Amendment freedoms, isn't that right? No response. The detectives went silent, too, for a minute, changing tactics. Pavitz picked up the bag containing the unspent cartridge. He began to toy with it in front of the kid. Holy Moses, what the hell is this? Detective Pavitz chided. Then he looked up at the kid. You were out there, like, slaying werewolves or something, tough guy? No, Pellman crowed back, folding his arms across his chest. This tough guy is a gangsta. A silver bullet's his calling card. Like, mess with me and you get whacked with my silver bullet. Then Pellman said to the kid, Is that right? Is this like your calling card or something? All they got from the kid was a dead stare from cold blue eyes. All right, bro, sighed Pellman, and then he said to Pavitz, We got us a real badass here. Oh, a real tough guy, Pavitz replied. He dropped the evidence bag down on the table in front of the kid and said, The silver bullet hitman, is that what you think you are? The kid said nothing back to either of them. Pellman picked up the evidence bag containing the unspent cartridge. He held it up a few inches from the kid's face. This is going to bury you, tough guy, he said to the kid. We're keeping you for illegal discharge of a firearm. You'll be in front of a judge this afternoon. That's just a start. The second we get a body down at the morgue with a silver slug in them, your ass is going up for murder. I don't know yet how old you are, but I suspect you're under 18. You're probably thinking that maybe that'll protect you here. But it won't. When we find out who you shot, you will be charged as an adult, big boy. Got that? The detective stood up and got ready to walk out. Pellman turned and jabbed a finger in the air towards the boy's stony, impassive face. I hope whatever you did, it was worth it, he growled at the kid. Pellman and Pavitz exited the room. A few moments later, Carrington and Guthridge came in. I'm Detective Carrington, the older detective introduced himself. That there's Detective Guthridge. I'm down here from homicide. Heard about you and your illegal firearm and your fancy bullets. The kid said nothing. Guthridge remained standing, and Carrington pulled up a chair right next to the kid. Carrington said, Hey, look at me when I'm talking to you. The kid waited 2 seconds, staring at the wall across from him. Right when Carrington licked his lower lip and was about to speak again, the kid rotated his head to face Carrington. Carrington licked his lower lip again and had to start over. "Tell me, straight up. Just be straight up with me," Carrington said, leaning in closer. "Man to man, did you kill somebody with that gun? Am I going to have to notify someone's parents that their child is dead from one of your fancy-ass bullets?" The kid's shoulders were relaxed. He held his head up and stayed completely motionless. All Carrington got in response to his question was an icy stare from a square, expressionless face. It could have been the face of a professional poker player. It could have been the face of a homicidal maniac. Nothing was revealed in those unblinking eyes. Carrington held the kid's gaze for several long seconds, forcing himself to return the gaze, forcing his own eyes to stay open despite the fact that they were beginning to really burn. Finally, he had to look down. He blinked, leaned back, and let out a long breath. The kid still hadn't blinked. "Well, you really are a player, aren't you?" Carrington said. "Well, we'll have you cool your heels a bit before your arraignment." Carrington leaned back a bit more and called over his shoulder. "Officer Abbott, take this young fella to his holding cell." Guthridge walked out of the interview room. A patrol officer named Abbott came in and stood by the door. Carrington got up and undid the immobilization bolt. Carrington and Abbott stood the kid up, and Abbott led him out. The kid and the officer were quite a pair as they made their way through the precinct. Carrington watched them go and thought it looked like an elephant in jeans and a T-shirt being walked by a doll dressed up as a cop. Guthridge came over to Carrington. "You want to take off?" she asked. "Get some sleep?" "No," Carrington replied. "Think I'll stick around a bit longer. What's the girl's name, the one this kid carried into the hospital?" "The victim's name is Caroline Marsh, 20 years old. I just got word she's awake and can communicate," Guthridge said. "Yeah?" said Carrington. Then he said, "You up for a trip to the hospital? I think I want to talk to this girl, if you don't mind." Abbott escorted the kid to a wing of the building where there were a dozen temporary holding cells. Abbott and his prisoner were buzzed in through the inner gate, and the kid was led to the first cell on the right. The inmate in the first cell on the left saw what was happening through the small square window in his door and immediately began screaming at them. He seemed to have been raised with a vocabulary of only about 2 words, both of which he spewed forth with great alacrity. Abbott held the kid by one arm and fed his key card into the swipe machine. The door clicked open. "That's enough, Mr. Clark." Abbott turned and said to the other inmate. The other inmate ignored the officer completely and continued hollering his 2 favorite words over and over again at the kid. Several inmates in the holding cells further down the hall stopped yelling at each other for a moment and started to hoot and howl with laughter at whatever humor they saw in this situation. Officer Abbott silently guided the kid into the cell, who then turned and held out the handcuffs up to Abbott. "No, you're keeping those on until we get you over to the court," Abbott said. "Sit tight." Abbott closed the door, which clicked into its locked state automatically. He glanced at the kid through the tiny window. The kid was just sitting there on the cell's bed, silent, hands shackled in front of him. Abbott walked to the end of the hall, ignoring the cacophony of the other prisoners. "Coming out," Abbott called, and the officer on the other side of the gate buzzed him through. "You off?" the other officer, who was working the gate, asked Abbott after he got through. "Yep," Abbott replied. "I'm going straight to shift change, and then I'm out of this hellhole for the whole weekend. Taking Sammy and the kids to her parents' house at the lake." "That's terrific," the other officer said. "Get out of here, man. Get your mind out of here. Play with those kids and catch some trout or something." "Bass," Abbott replied. "Lake stocked with bass." Abbott headed for his end-of-shift procedure. He had to stand around in the break room and wait for a bit for his supervisor to show up. He started thinking about the lake house, about driving there and how tired he and his wife would be after the drive, but how they would get the kids to bed in short order upon arrival. Suddenly, Abbott realized his key card was gone. It was supposed to be on the lanyard attached to his belt, but it was gone. The young officer felt rage and panic build up in him. He patted every inch of his shirt and pants, trying to detect its small, hard rectangle. He looked at the floor behind him. Then his training kicked in. Abbott ran out to the hallway and smashed his fist on the lockdown button. Then he rushed back to the cell block's gate where he had just been. "That kid's got my card," Abbott told his fellow officer, who was still sitting there. "Check all the door signals." "Shit, we got one open," the other officer said. "I knew it. Buzz me in there," said Abbott. Hold on," said the other officer. "Nobody's going nowhere. No need to break protocol. We keep things locked down and wait for the emergency response team to show up and deal with this." Abbott peered through the gate's peephole. There was a door open all right, but to his confusion it was the door on the left, opposite where he had just settled the kid. "Cell number HCA has been opened," Abbott asked. "Who is an HCA? Is that still Clark in there?" "That's Devon Clark," the other officer replied. "He hasn't been moved since you left." The two officers waited, tense and nervous. The prisoners down at the end of the row of cells kept up their clamor amongst themselves without ceasing. Finally, the phone next to them in the security booth rang. It was the emergency response team. They were in the central lobby and calling to be buzzed up to the cell block. The response team was buzzed into the hallway next to the security booth. They comprised 8 officers, all of them clad in black tactical gear and carrying ballistic shields. They squeezed their armored bulks down to the hall and came to the gate next to Abbott and his fellow officer. "The prisoner is Devon Clark," Abbott said to them. "He got his door open, first one on the left." "Okay," the emergency response team's head officer said. "You two guys, get in the back of us. We're going in shields first." The door to the cell block was buzzed open. The group of officers hustled into the hallway in tight formation, followed by Abbott and his fellow officer in the rear. They all formed a tight semicircle around the open doorway to the cell on the left, HCA. Abbott and the other officer tried to peer over the heads and shoulders of the men in front of them to ascertain what had happened to their prisoner. "Devon Clark," the head officer called out from where he stood in front of his men. "Come on, man, you don't want to be facing additional charges. Come on out here." There was no response, just the hooting and howling of the amused inmates further down the cell block. "Okay, move," the head officer told his men. Unhurriedly, the emergency response team huddled up close to the open cell and got ready to barge in. The head officer paused at the door, looking in. Then he straightened up, lowered his baton, and stepped inside the cell. "Empty," he said. "Initiate a full lockdown of the entire facility. Damn it, call internal affairs and start a full lockdown. We got ourselves a Houdini." Abbott turned to leave back through the gate with the other officers. Before doing so, he took a quick look into HCB, the cell on the right, where he had just left the kid handcuffed and sitting on his bunk. Oddly, the kid seemed to be taking a nap through all the commotion. He was calmly lying on his side, with the cheap, thin cell blanket pulled all the way up over him, his knees pulled up comfortably in a fetal position. Dennis Peltry first encountered his prince at a point in life when Peltry was certain his one short arc of existence would soon be over. Not only would his life finally and irreversibly end, it would do so in irredeemable disappointment. There had been many hardships bearing down on his fellow countrymen in those days, following the collapse of the markets and the news of men jumping out of buildings. There had been years of high unemployment and desperation in every state Peltry had wandered through. But what bore down on Peltry was the fast approaching and final void. Peltry was running out of time. Each morning when he shaved, the mirror forced Peltry to look upon a man of decreasing stature, slowly but surely growing gray and frail. Great dust clouds were ravaging his nation's farms at the time and driving his countrymen off the land. But what hung over Peltry, casting impenetrable shadows, were the clouds of failure and doom. All his attempts, all his rackets, all his schemes had so far led to naught. Every one of his associates and accomplices had failed Peltry in one way or another. So when the time came for him to choose between loyalty to his co-conspirators or more time in jail, Peltry graduated from thief and murderer to betrayer and informant. He ratted on the Chicago gang. He shared all he knew about them to the fledgling Federal Bureau of Investigation. Doing so saved him from yet another stint of wasted time in jail, but it made him a hunted man who could never set foot in Illinois again. Peltry fled south to his boyhood home, to the dank, sweltering counties of western Louisiana, where he had spent his formative years, being dragged by his alcoholic father from logging camp to logging camp. But Peltry was no longer a boy. He was now the broken wreckage of a man slipping relentlessly into old age. Time was moving faster and faster for Peltry. The world around him was changing at a dizzying pace, and it felt like he could not keep up anymore. People were starting to listen to radios and using washing machines. The roads were filling up with automobiles and becoming increasingly lined with telephone poles. The puddles that formed in the streets of the towns he passed through were no longer horses' urine. They were the fluids leaked from car engines. Instead of wood smoke, the air had begun to smell like lead-tinted exhaust and sulfur, even when Peltry was out in the countryside. The morning sunrise crept up on him day after day. It had become like a tolling bell, marking his progression toward that final hour when he knew he would lose everything he'd hoped for, forever. Peltry grew to hate the sight of the morning sun. His thoughts became darker and more vile. Peltry was kept in check from taking his anger out on unwitting strangers in the night, only by the fear of bringing himself more trouble. His heart grew even more covetous. He no longer desired riches and possessions that were not his. What Peltry wanted now was time beyond what nature had allotted him. There were, he knew, women in the deepest, darkest corners of the parishes of his boyhood home who held powers beyond this world. These were secretive, glassy-eyed, and malevolent women, gnarled and twisted like the limbs of the live oaks that filled the swamplands. These women had spent ages practicing primeval incantations and the enchantment of roaming devils. For a price, so the stories went, some of these women could be convinced to share the dark fruits of their sorcery with men like Peltry. He knew he had to find one of these women if it was the last thing he ever did. Peltry searched all over Louisiana as well as Mississippi. More than once he roamed New Orleans chasing a possible lead, trying to find one of these ancient sorceresses. Finally, one night in a forgotten churchyard just outside Baton Rouge, Peltry placed the last of his crumpled dollars into a leathery hand held outstretched to him from the doorway of an open crypt. In return, Peltry was handed a poultice, an amulet carved from the thigh bone of an executed criminal, and a set of instructions for communing with a lesser prince of hell. A fortnight later, Peltry was back in the same churchyard, just past the last gravestone, where the edge of the forest stood dark and foreboding. He uttered the incantation, holding his proselchic talismans up to the night air. And his prince appeared, stepping out from a dark space between two trees, his satanic grin gleaming in the light of the full moon. After that night in the graveyard, the flow of time changed in many ways for Dennis Peltry. He was outside of it now, safe from time's ravages as he toiled day and night in the enthrallment of his prince. As long as his master roamed the earth, time could no longer bring Peltry closer to oblivion with each passing day. He could now be a detached observer of time's effect on the frenetic world of the scurrying chattel called humanity. Peltry could laugh and watch bemusedly as their wars came and went, as their sons walked on the moon, and hoped their frail sciences could one day deliver them from suffering and mortality. Certainly the world kept changing in ways that Peltry never found easy to fathom. New technologies sprung up every day. There were new roads and new buildings everywhere he looked. New items appeared on store shelves. Peltry struggled immensely every time he had to use a modern gas station pump to refill the tank of his master's old Cadillac. But Peltry could share in his master's pitch-black delight at the mounting sins humankind kept committing against itself and the planet that birthed it. Now it was a handful of hours past midnight. The moon was full and full of menace, just like it had been in the graveyard that fateful evening so long ago. Peltry was driving his prince through the dark to another drinking ceremony. Awaiting their arrival were the thralls of two other princes, along with a pair of lesser servants his prince referred to as acolytes. These acolyte humans were still in time and hardly more than common chattel, but their deaths were deferred. Acolytes had their uses. The two acolytes had been charged with bringing the sacrifice to the drinking ceremony that night. She was in the trunk of their car. This young woman had been initially coaxed into their midst 7 months prior, and coerced ever since into serving as a source of crimson for his grace. Peltry knew this sacrifice time was now up. Chattel that are assets quickly become liabilities. Tonight his prince would drink ever so deeply, glass after glass, until every drop of crimson had finally been drained from the victim's wounded and tortured body. The acolytes would cast her remains into a shallow grave shortly after the sun came up, and immediately go searching for another. For centuries, the chattel's social structures had been carefully tuned to produce an abundance of non-persons. In the modern world, these were the invisible denizens of homeless camps, halfway houses, drug dens, illegal immigrant communities, and other such demimondes full of chattel made vulnerable to cultic manipulation and lures. The acolytes would have no problem finding their next victim from among such richly stocked hunting grounds. Peltry was not to witness that night's ceremony. He rarely ever was. His task after delivering his grace to the ceremonial site was to immediately take the Cadillac to the river's edge a few miles away and replenish the mound of dirt in its trunk. The remaining thralls and acolytes would tend to his prince while Peltry was gone. As Peltry pulled the Cadillac into the woodland clearing, he saw 2 parked cars. One was empty. That one would be used for the ceremony and then later buried. The other car still held its occupants, 2 thralls who Peltry knew as Damien and Hirth, stepped out of the car, along with 2 acolytes whose names Peltry couldn't be bothered to remember. Peltry watched as they all went to the rear of the car they had come in. The trunk was opened. The sacrifice, dull and numb to what was happening to her, was pulled out. Peltry parked the Cadillac, got out, and went around the back of it and opened its trunk lid. When his prince had fully risen, Peltry took from his own coat pocket a small brush with an ornately chased handle. He devotedly swept the flecks of dirt from the suit worn by his grace. Then Peltry knelt down and swept clean his shoes. Peltry stood. "Your grace," he extolled. The sacrifict was being forced into the back seat of the empty car. Damien led Peltry's master to the car with the sacrifict. The ceremony was about to begin. But Peltry did not linger. He closed the trunk of the Cadillac, got in behind the wheel, and drove off. Peltry had heard of other princes who preferred dirt from fresh graves, or from certain ruins, or from, of all things, the leachate-contaminated soils of landfills. His prince, however, required the tainted muck that could be found next to a disused and polluted body of water. So Peltry headed for the banks of a nearby creek that flowed wide and slow into the small city adjacent the woodland. On the way, Peltry had to stop for gasoline. He pulled the Cadillac up beneath the lights of the steel and concrete canopy held aloft over the gas pumps of a busy and anonymous station. He stepped out of the vehicle. Immediately, Peltry's ears were assaulted by what passed for music these days. The noise blared from tiny speakers hidden somewhere in the face of the gas pump, interspersed with frantic advertisements for the rancid fare available at the counter inside. Slowly and methodically, Peltry began to navigate the bewildering array of lights, buttons, card readers, and digital displays that the gas pump proffered. He had always resented changing social mores which had introduced the custom of pumping one's own gas. As Peltry searched his vest pockets for the plastic card he would use against the blaring, blinking machine in front of him, he was hit with a sharp, overwhelming bolt of pain. It felt like someone inside his chest had savagely struck his breastbone with a hammer. He doubled over and almost vomited. Peltry was shocked and confused. He had not had to worry about heart attacks since before there was such a thing as television. With his mind addled by the grotesque pain in his chest, Peltry struggled to climb back in behind the wheel of the Cadillac. Forgetting about filling the tank, he restarted the engine and continued on toward the creek. The Cadillac rolled past the last of the thin, scraggly trees at the creek's edge, and as far as it could go before its tires became completely mired in the mud of the bank. Still reeling from the mortal pain inside his chest, hoping it would just go away, Peltry parked the vehicle. He managed to climb out and get the trunk open. He retrieved the short-handled shovel from inside of it. To his horror, Peltry saw that his hands had become withered. The skin on them looked like mottled wax. He could see the bones in his wrists. Peltry staggered over to the water's edge in the early morning light. With his strength beginning to wane, Peltry forced himself to scoop up a shovelful of mud. He struggled back to the open trunk and dumped the fresh muck inside of it. Leaving the shovel sticking out of the trunk, Peltry lurched around to the side of the car. There was now enough light that Peltry was able to see his visage reflected in the driver's side rear window. He screamed. What stared back at him looked more like a mummy from an old black-and-white horror movie than it did a living man. Without warning, time had caught up with Dennis Peltry all at once. He fell into the driver's seat. None of what was happening made any sense to Peltry. As long as his prince stalked the dark corners of this world, Peltry was supposed to be safe from calamities such as this. He felt his body collapsing like a papier-mâché doll that had suddenly been doused with a bucket of water. Clinging desperately to the steering wheel, Peltry cried out for his master. Sitting in Caroline Marsh's hospital room, Detective Carrington felt a wave of exhaustion hit him and he had to stop the interview for a few beats. He was getting old, he knew it. He couldn't power through the lack of sleep the way he was able to when he was younger. But he was still a cop, and this was still a case. Carrington was on the hunt and could not let go. He took a moment to press a finger and a thumb against his eyeballs while he took a deep breath, waiting a second for the waning energy to reverse itself. It had been a long, tough week. Carrington was used to long, tough weeks, but this particular day was turning out like no other. "Okay," he said. "Miss Marsh, take me through these events one more time." Over the course of his career, Carrington had heard some exceedingly wild tales fall from the lips of both suspects and victims. His cop sense had always been reliable in sifting the tragically true from the laughably bogus. But Carrington was not at all sure how to categorize the story Caroline Marsh had just got done telling him and Detective Guthridge. Marsh lay on the hospital bed with her neck and her arm heavily bandaged. Monitors were attached to her wrist and chest, and there was an IV going into her taped-up hand. Marsh's dark eyes held a rigid stare over Carrington's shoulder, past Guthridge, out to where the sun had just begun to appear at the top corner of the window frame. Guthridge turned to see what Caroline was looking at. "Honey, is the sun too bright?" Guthridge asked, and she went to close the blinds. "No," Marsh yelled, and then more calmly said, "No, keep them open." "Miss Marsh," Carrington said, "we gotta go back through your story again. To be honest, we need to go back over it because this one's a doozy." Marsh kept staring out the window. "I gotta get all this straight," Carrington said. "So, if what you're telling me is the truth, then it should be pretty easy to do what I'm about to ask you to do. I need you to tell me the exact same story you just got done telling us. But this time, we're going to start at the very end of your story, and we're going to go backwards, one step at a time. Can you do that?" The only indication that Marsh heard what the detective said was briefly spreading the fingers on both hands from where they lay on the hospital sheet. "Okay, here we go," said Carrington. "Let's start with, have you ever been in this hospital before?" Marsh shook her head no, still staring out the window. The sun had crept further into view by a few millimeters. "What's your first memory of this hospital, then?" asked Carrington. Marsh opened her mouth this time and tried to say something, but all that came out was rasping. Guthridge stepped over and helped her get a sip of water from a tiny paper cup on the nightstand next to the bed. "Waking up here this morning, downstairs in the ICU," Marsh was finally able to say. "Okay, tell me, what do you remember immediately before that happening?" asked Carrington. "Right before you got to this hospital." "The boy was carrying me," Marsh said. "Carrying you? Carrying you how?" asked Carrington. "Like this," Marsh said, bending both elbows, then cupping her hands and raising them slightly off the bed sheets. It was in the aspect of someone carrying a small child. "You mean he was just carrying you around like a bag of groceries?" Carrington asked. "Yeah," said Marsh. "Well, he was carrying me here." "What road were you on? What street name?" asked Carrington. "I don't know," said Marsh. "I have no idea what streets he took me down to get here." Guthridge interjected. "Honey, do you remember passing anything while he was carrying you? Do you remember any landmarks, any buildings?" Marsh told the two detectives the name of a couple of stores and restaurants she remembered being taken past. They all had been closed that early in the morning, but she remembered a few names and roughly in what order she saw them. Before that, she only remembered seeing trees overhead. But it was enough information for Carrington and Guthridge to surmise that Marsh had been brought in from somewhere north of the city, where a heavily wooded park sat. That park also shared a border with a large national forest. The park was 3.5 miles from the hospital they were now in. Carrington said, Miss Marsh, most people can't even walk that far by themselves. You're sure this guy lugged you all by himself, all that way? Could it be that he put you in a car? Guthridge asked. No, said Marsh. He picked me up, held me in his arms, walked with me out of the woods. Then the sun started coming up, and he carried me through town to the hospital. Carrington and Guthridge traded glances. Then Carrington said to Marsh, Okay, think back to the clearing where this guy picked you up. What happened immediately before he picked you up and carried you? He asked me if I could walk, Marsh said. And you said? Nothing, Marsh said. I don't know why. I really couldn't get any words out. I just showed him my arm. She indicated her heavily bandaged arm. Okay, right before you two started talking, what happened immediately before that? Carrington asked. He kicked Damien in the side of the head, Marsh said. How could this guy's foot reach someone's head like that? Guthridge asked. Damien was down on all fours already, Marsh said. How'd that happen? Carrington asked. He just kicked Damien in the balls, Marsh said. How, like this? Asked Carrington. He stood up, faced Guthridge, and vaguely mimed kicking at her. No, Marsh said. From behind. He was behind Damien when he kicked him. How did he get behind Damien? Carrington asked. He stepped behind Damien, Marsh said. Why's that? Carrington asked. Because Damien was coming at me with the knife, Marsh said. Okay, well, I'm glad he stopped Damien from hurting you, Carrington said. Okay, right. Before this guy Damien came at you with a knife, what was happening? They were just kind of circling each other, Marsh said. Who? Carrington asked. The boy and Damien, Marsh said. Damien was still holding up the knife like he was going to try it again and stab him, and the boy was pointing his revolver at Damien and telling him to drop the knife. Damien was also trying to work his magic on the boy while he was holding the knife up. Yeah, you said that before, Carrington said. You said Damien could work his magic on people, get him to do things. Honey, you realize that's not magic, right? Guthridge said. That's just what cults do to control people. It's called brainwashing. Yeah, well, okay, I guess, said Marsh, gazing past them again at the window, gauging the position of the sun. Okay, what was Damien saying to this guy? Carrington asked. Marsh looked back at him and said, Damien was doubled over and bleeding pretty bad, so he was having trouble getting his usual words out. Why was he bleeding? Carrington asked. He'd just stabbed himself in the leg, Marsh said. Which leg? Carrington asked. Damien stabbed himself in his right leg, Marsh said. He'd come up behind the boy from around the burning car. Damien was screaming, What have you done? What have you done? And he had the big knife in his right hand. He raised it up and he swung it down at the boy. I guess the boy heard Damien coming. He took one little step to the side, and the knife swung down and Damien stabbed himself in the thigh. Carrington asked, Why did he do that? Why did Damien want to stab this young man? Because the boy had just shot his Grace through the back seat, and now the car was on fire, Marsh said. Okay, which car was on fire? Asked Carrington. The one that was already there when we got there, Marsh said. I saw it parked there in the clearing in the woods when they got me out of the trunk of the car I was in. What caused the car to catch fire? Carrington asked. I don't know, Marsh said, but the prince and the other ones are not of this world. Stuff doesn't affect them the way it does you and me. I don't know, maybe his Grace started the fire when he got shot. Or maybe he caught on fire when he started to die. Right, said Carrington. These princes you told us about, these are the ones everyone has to address as Your Grace? Are they the ones in charge of the cult that kidnapped you? Guthridge asked. Yeah, said Marsh, after taking a moment to gather her thoughts. But it's the adduced ones who kind of do everything else. Wait, the adduced ones? Guthridge asked. These are different from the ones you call the acolytes? Yeah, replied Marsh. Acolytes are still mostly like you and me. Carrington had to pause and give the bridge of his nose another squeeze. Then he continued questioning Marsh. Okay, take me to right before the blaze started, he said. What was going on? Okay, right before the car started burning, they had me sitting in the back seat of the car, said Marsh. All I know is the fire started in the back seat, right where his Grace was sitting when he got shot. Which car? Carrington asked. The car that was already there when they drove me up there, Marsh said. When the kid shot his Grace, Damien and all of them grabbed me and pulled me out of it and threw me on the ground. Then Damien, Hartley, and Hirth were all piled up inside the car screaming and trying to help save his Grace. Okay, go back to when you were sitting in the back seat of the other car, Carrington said. What happened right before they pulled you out and threw you on the ground? That's when I heard the gun. It went off in the trunk, Marsh said. His Grace sort of started grasping at the front of his shirt like this, and stuff started pouring out of his mouth. There was blood and stuff like that coming out of the mouth of the gunshot victim, Guthridge asked. No, it was more like motor oil, said Marsh, and it had this smell. Smell? Asked Guthridge. What kind of smell? Marsh said, the way a dead cat would smell after it's been rotting in the sun for a couple of days. So you hear the gunshot, and then your captors drag you out of the car so they can deal with the emergency. Then what happened? Asked Carrington. I was lying on the ground. I heard the trunk pop open, said Marsh. Out steps this huge blonde kid. He's holding a revolver. It's still got smoke coming out of the barrel. Then Damien and all of them jump out of the car, well, like they'd all been burned. The car was catching on fire from the back seat. And then they all noticed the guy who had just climbed out of the trunk. Describe him to us, this guy who climbed out of the trunk, said Guthridge. He was really tall, said Marsh, and he was big, like an ape at the zoo, real long arms, blonde, T-shirt and jeans, blue eyes, kind of scary looking. Well, really scary looking, actually, but he still looked like a kid, like he could still be in high school. Then what happened? Carrington asked. Kyle and Hartley ran and jumped back in the car they came in, the one they brought me in. They just jumped in and drove off when they saw the boy with the gun, Marsh said. The boy tucked the gun into his waistband. Then Damien came around the car behind him and tried to stab him. The boy just stepped aside and let Damien stab himself. Then Hirth, who was kind of standing over me but with his back to me, started going for the gun that he had in his own waistband. So Hirth had a gun, asked Carrington. This was a second gun that you saw in Hirth's waistband. And Hirth is one of these acolytes? Guthridge asked. No, said Marsh, getting a little flustered. No, Damien and Hirth are one of the adduced ones. Time is starting not to affect them. Kyle and Hartley are still acolytes. She looked from Carrington to Guthridge, hoping this was all now finally making sense, like she was trying to describe a finer point of geology to two not very bright students. Did Hirth have this gun the whole time? Guthridge asked. Yeah, said Marsh. I'd seen it before. I knew he had it. And that's part of why I got in the trunk of the car and let them drive me out there in the woods for the ceremony. So, Damien's just stabbed himself, and Hirth is going for the gun he's got tucked in his belt, said Carrington. Well, what happened next? The boy took a step forward and punched Hirth in the head before he could pull his gun all the way out, said Marsh. Okay, what happened to Hirth's gun? Asked Carrington. I don't know, said Marsh. Hirth had almost got it all the way out of his waistband when the boy punched him. Hirth spun around like he was doing some kind of breakdancing move, then he flopped on the ground. He looked dead to me. The gun must have went flying somewhere over in the leaves. Okay, what happened right after that? Carrington asked. Well, I heard the crash, said Marsh. Kyle and Hartley's car had skidded off the road and hit a tree. Geez, said Carrington. So they were all of a sudden trying to drive away? Guthridge asked. Yeah, said Marsh. Kyle and Hartley. They weren't supposed to do that. They'll be sundered for that. Okay, then what happened? Asked Carrington. Damien and the guy were circling each other, Marsh said. Damien pulled the knife out of his leg and he was holding it up, but also using his words. He was trying to talk the boy into joining them. The kid had pulled his revolver back out and was telling Damien to drop the knife. A nurse came into the room to switch out the IV in Marsh's hand. Carrington and Guthridge stepped out of the room. What a story, huh? Said Carrington. Guthridge had to laugh and shake her head. That girl can fabricate some wild stuff, she said. Guthridge checked her notes, then said, But no contradictions yet from the story she told us earlier. So far she hasn't tripped up, even while telling it to us backwards. Well, what do we actually know? Asked Carrington. Guthridge checked the messages that had come in on her phone over the past several minutes. Officers are at the crime scene processing it now. It's in a clearing you got to drive through, part of the national forest to get to, but it actually sits in an area that belongs to the city. It's at the end of a dirt service road. One way in, one way out. They found 2 cars, like Marsh said. One's completely burned. One is wrecked. No victims on the scene, no witnesses, no bodies found. Well, what about the gun Marsh said that Hirth had? Carrington asked. Nope, said Guthridge. Gone, if it was ever there to begin with. I knew there'd be no bodies, Carrington said. Her story about somebody burning up in one of the cars is baloney. She and that kid probably dumped gas on it and then lit it when they were abandoning it. There's indication that a 3rd car was on the scene at some point. Some kind of large luxury car. Cadillac, maybe, Guthridge said to Carrington. The nurse finished and came out. Both detectives started to go back in, but Guthridge's phone rang. I got to take this call, Guthridge said to Carrington. Get back in there with Marsh and stick to the plan. Keep her describing everything backwards. You started to deviate a bit there, and you let her go back into storytelling mode. Carrington was pressing his finger and thumb against his eyeballs again. Yeah, I just realized I did that. Carrington stepped back into the room where Caroline Marsh was still in her bed. Marsh was staring fixedly out the window from her bed. Her skin was ashen, almost the color of the sheets. Carrington assured her that she was now safe and that everything was going to be fine. Marsh turned to him, made eye contact. Then she slowly began to shake her head. They will find me, Marsh said. Nobody knows you're here, Miss Marsh, Carrington said. They will augur my presence, Marsh said, no matter where I run. I fully understand you've just survived something awful, Carrington said, and I can understand you're being shook up. But you have my protection. Same goes for Detective Guthridge. We're going to get these guys. We just need you to help us. You, is all Marsh said. She was struggling for words. Me what? Asked Carrington. You feel their caress. You need protection, she said. Carrington just smiled at the wounded girl. Oh, I certainly hope they do come for me, Carrington assured her. That'll make my job a whole lot easier. Now, Miss Marsh, Carrington continued. Right before this, his Grace fellow started grabbing at his chest and bleeding from the mouth. What happened right before that? I heard the gun go off, Marsh said. Where was the gun when it went off? It came from right behind his Grace. In the trunk, Marsh said. What happened right before the gun went off? Carrington asked. His Grace was sitting beside me drinking a glass of my blood, Marsh said. How did he get the blood? Hartley drained it from my arm, Marsh said, pointing at her arm. This happened where? Carrington asked. In the back seat they had me in, said Marsh. Hartley reached around. Where was Hartley? Carrington interrupted. Tell me where Hartley was when this happened. She had climbed in beside me, so I couldn't get out, Marsh said. She had a black knife and a little glass bowl with all these snakes' heads carved onto them. Looked like Aztec or something. She held up my wrist and cut my arm here, just below my wrist, and let the blood dribble down my elbow into the bowl. I didn't even feel it at first. She handed the bowl with my blood in it to His Grace, and then he went to take a drink, and then the gun went off in the trunk. Who else was in the car with you? There was Damien and Hirth up front, Marsh said. Kyle was standing outside next to the car. Well, why was Kyle doing that? Marsh said. He was just there being the driver. He's not very high up in the group. Kyle drove the car you were in, the one where this Grace guy got shot? No, Kyle drove the other car, Marsh said. I came in the car that Kyle was driving, in the trunk. Then they took me out and put me in the other car that was already parked there with nobody in it. So you rode with Kyle? I rode in the trunk of the car that Kyle was driving, Marsh said. Hirth put me in the trunk, then he and Hartley rode while Kyle drove. Carrington asked, Were you forced into the trunk? Yeah, Marsh replied. I guess they didn't want me losing my nerve and trying to scream or escape or something. This wasn't my first drinking ritual. They knew I knew what I was in for. Go back to when Hartley cut your arm, Carrington said. What happened immediately before that? They were chanting, Marsh said. Hartley, Damien, Hirth, all of them were chanting. They do these chants that sound like Latin. Okay, what happened before they started chanting? The Cadillac drove away to get more dirt before the sun came up. Who was driving the Cadillac? I don't know. I didn't really see. But I think that one is driven by one of the adduced ones. I think his name is Dennis Peltry. Older guy. Been around a while. I'm sorry, but you need to help me out here, Miss Marsh, Carrington said. What makes someone adduced? How does that compare to an acolyte? Marsh replied, Given greater darkness. Okay, let's get back to discussing the actual crime scene, Carrington said. Tell me again, how many cars were there in total? 3, Marsh replied. The car I came in, the car that was there, and then the Cadillac. Was it still dark out, or had the sun come up yet? It was still dark out. What happened right before that? Damien helped His Grace sit in the back seat next to me. What happened before that? His Grace rose up out of the trunk of the Cadillac. What happened before that? The Cadillac drove up and parked. Its driver walked around and popped the trunk. How'd your neck get like that, Miss Marsh? Did His Grace do that to you too? No, another one did this to me 2 nights ago. Who was the other one? They never tell me their names. It's not His Grace? That's how they're referred to. Where did this happen 2 nights ago? Carrington asked. Same place in the woods? No, this happened at the library. There's a prince who sleeps under a marble slab. Carrington hesitated, but then asked Marsh where she thought the library was located. She started giving a long, disjointed description that included dogs, a long road through a forest, a big lawn, and a large marble house with candles burning in the window. All of it made even less sense than the story about the shooting the day before. Carrington cut her off. Okay, so suffice to say for now that what just happened to you wasn't your first drinking ceremony, Carrington said. Is that right? This has been going on for a while? Yeah, no, I think this was my fourth, Marsh replied. The acolytes, they don't tell you the names of the princes. Did you ever overhear these guys' names? Carrington asked. I'm not told their names, Marsh replied. She had gone back to staring out the window across the room. Where did the other ones happen? Carrington asked. The other drinking ceremonies. At the art house, Marsh replied. Why do you call it the art house? Carrington asked. It's in the middle of a cornfield. It has all these paintings in it, Marsh said. So this Your Grace person and his acolytes assaulted you there as well? Carrington asked. No, this was another one. Hirth and Damien were always there, but this was a different one, Marsh replied. This was a different prince at this place you're calling the art house? Carrington asked. Yes, Marsh said. And something similar happened to you there at this art house? You were the victim of an assault and theft of your blood? Carrington asked. Then he said, Miss Marsh, please, this is important. Marsh was staring out the window with a stark expression of horror on her face. Miss Marsh, Carrington said again. Yes, barely a whisper. You were there for a while, weren't you? Carrington asked. Yes, Marsh said. What else can you remember happening to you there? What did you see? You saw a lot of paintings, you said? Carrington asked. Yeah, Marsh said. Like really old paintings. Statues, too. Old, like this other prince person was a art collector? Did he seem wealthy? Carrington asked. The house was falling down, Marsh said. Oh, the house was in bad shape? Carrington asked. Yeah, not some place you or I would want to live. I see, said Carrington. Miss Marsh, this may be hard, but what else happened to you at this art house? What else besides the drinking ceremony? They made me sit for a portrait, Marsh said. So they took photographs of you? Carrington asked. No, said Marsh. I had to sit for a portrait painting. What, like with paints and brushes? Carrington asked. I guess. I couldn't really see what was going on. How's that? You were blindfolded? Carrington asked. No, said Marsh. The room was really dark. I couldn't see anything. I could just smell the paint thinner His Grace was using. He was painting you? Carrington asked. Completely in the dark? Yeah, said Marsh. Okay, Miss Marsh, let's try to get some actual details on your captors. Did you catch this guy's name when you were at the art house? There was a long pause. Marsh's frozen stare remained riveted on the window. The sun had crept a little lower in the sky. Miss Marsh, did you ever hear a name? Carrington asked again. Yes, Marsh finally replied. Okay, what is it? Carrington asked. Marsh's head rotated, doll-like, to Carrington. At first, her eyes were glassy, and then they regained her focus, and she looked at Carrington. Then she looked at the hospital door. Then she leaned in as close as the ivy would allow her, and spoke as softly as she possibly could. She spoke the name so fearfully quiet that Carrington had to write down what he thought he heard, and hold the notebook up to her for confirmation. Marsh looked at the letters on his notebook and trembled, then nodded her head. Carrington had written LeBlanc. Guthridge stepped in and told Carrington she had to pull him away. They both had to head back to the station immediately. Carrington sighed with resignation, thanked Marsh for her time, and then left her alone in the hospital room. Marsh watched the door close behind them, then turned her head to look out the window again, at where the sun hung in the hazy sky. The police station had an air of barely controlled chaos when Guthridge and Carrington returned from the hospital. Devon Clark was still missing. The facility was in lockdown. The sheriff's department was now on scene and started to conduct their own search. Carrington and Guthridge knew there would be hell to pay after they'd recovered Clark from wherever he'd run off to. A few minutes later, Guthridge called Carrington into the precinct's control room. "You need to see something," she said. At each of the dozen monitors in the control room, there were 1 or 2 officers hunched over it, playing back sections of security video and scrutinizing every detail. Guthridge took Carrington over to a screen that was playing footage from earlier that morning of the big kid in the interrogation room. In the video, he was sitting at the table, giant shoulders relaxed, huge hands in front of him, the chain of the handcuffs held to the table by the immobilization bolt. Pellman and Pavitz were there in the video, still conducting their interview. The sound was off, but Carrington knew they were nearing the conclusion of their interview. Sure enough, Pavitz could be seen standing and collecting his papers as well as the evidence bags. Pellman had gotten up too, and could be seen jabbing his finger in the air towards the expressionless young prisoner. Then Carrington watched their backs in the video as they left. Next, the video showed the kid stand up in a flash and lean way over the table as far as his constraints would allow. His enormous hands splayed out wide and flat on top of the table as he strained ferociously against the handcuffs. The kid stuck out his right elbow and started steadily rotating his right hand, putting a ferocious amount of effort into it. There was a visible snapping motion that Carrington could practically hear despite the sound being off. "Holy crap, did he just snap his wrist?" Carrington asked. "No, keep watching," Guthridge said. The kid sat right back down. Both hands went into his lap, out of sight for a second. The immobilization bolt was now empty and held nothing. Another second later, the kid whipped his hands back into their original position, twisting both hands inward towards the immobilization bolt to fiddle with the broken chain. Then he held perfectly still, as Carrington saw himself in the video and Guthridge open the door and walk in. "Looks like he broke the cuffs," Guthridge said. "Damn," Carrington balked. "How?" But it was obvious. The length of the lever times the force applied to it. The lever in this case was the kid's exceptionally long limbs and back, and the force was the absolutely simian strength of those muscles. The cuffs where the chain connects simply broke before the kid's bones did. Carrington swore under his breath as he hit fast forward on the tape. Sure enough, there was Carrington himself in the video, undoing the immobilization bolt and standing the kid up to be taken back to a holding cell with Officer Abbott. Abbott led the young prisoner out, holding his hands in front of him as if the cuffs were still intact. Both detectives rushed through the building to the cell block. They pushed past the small crowd of officers who had gathered around the opening to Devon Clark's empty cell and looked through the window into the cell opposite. There was still a sleeping form under the blanket on the bed. "We're waking this punk up," Carrington said to Guthridge. Then he yelled over to the officer at the gate to get HCB open. Both detectives stormed into the cell and yanked back the blanket. The person lying there was still breathing, but the side of his head was gashed and swollen like he'd been whacked with a baseball bat. It was Devon Clark. "Carrington, get me everything we got on this kid right now," Guthridge said. "Get it all. Bring it back to my desk. I want everything. Get his belongings from the locker." Carrington went and collected the intake docs for the kid. Then he went down to evidence and brought it all back to where Guthridge's desk was. Guthridge spread everything out on top of her desk. There was the pistol in its evidence bag and the casings, one of them still containing a silver bullet. But there was nothing else. "Where's his wallet?" Carrington asked. "Where's the kid's cell phone?" "He didn't have anything like that on him," Guthridge replied. "Just the gun. He had a library card and a toothbrush in his pocket. That's it. Those should be here. Did you get everything?" The toothbrush and the library card were nowhere to be seen. Carrington asked, "What's this kid's name?" "Jack Turner," Guthridge said. "That's it? Just Jack Turner?" Carrington asked. "That's it," said Guthridge. "Jack Turner. No middle name."